Coming off the loss to Indiana in the Big Ten championship, what do the Buckeyes need to fix in order to turn it around and win a national championship? I think there's a few major things. Obviously, kicking was a big problem. That, in my opinion, needs to be fixed. And then when you look at it, offensive play calling, maybe that's another key factor to look at. But I think the distractions that were caused in the Indiana game will not happen again throughout the playoffs. So really, it feels like it's setting up very well for Ohio State to have a solid chance at a repeat. That being said, I think that their quarterfinal matchup might be the toughest out of any of the teams with the bye, which seems a little bit backwards. But either Miami or Texas A&M is going to be a very difficult matchup. We'll start with Texas A&M and the fact that the Cotton Bowl is in Texas. This just seems kind of backwards that the number two team in the country is basically playing a road game. Neutral sites need to either be revamped to where you can't play a road game as the higher seed, or they need to go away and this game needs to be in Columbus. One of those two things needs to happen. Either way, I think Marcel Reed matches up very well against this Ohio State defense, but it's been the best one in the country. Ohio State probably still wins. When you look at Miami, they have a very solid defense. I still just think the Ohio State offense is going to be able to put off enough points against them. They won't have had to guard anybody close to the likes of Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, as well as face a quarterback as good as Julian Sayin. So I think Miami might have some struggles defensively. And then when you look at the Miami offense, Carson Beck is good, and he probably will be playing some pretty solid football if Miami has beaten Texas A&M at this point. But still, the Ohio State defense is the best one in the country for a reason. I think that they'd slow down Miami enough and get a win here.
Yeah, this game is going to be interesting because Ohio State is going to have to start hot, and that is something that I think they've actually struggled with over the past couple of years, just starting a game fast and quick and being in control early on. And whether it's A&M or Miami, they're going to be on a high streak. They're going to have a lot of momentum. A&M only has one loss on the year, and that was to Texas, obviously, in that rivalry game at the very end of the season. But a lot of people, I think, are counting them out because they're the seventh seed and because they didn't play in the SEC championship game and beat their rivals. But I still think they're a very good team, and I think Marcel Reed can give Ohio State some problems with his dual threat capability. And I think this receiving core that he has is also very, very dangerous. But it also is A&M, and maybe this is when the collapse starts to happen because they didn't go 8-4 this year. Miami has been one of the hottest teams in the country in the last couple weeks of the season. Granted, it wasn't against great competition, but they're playing at a very high level. And Carson Beck has been in big games before when he was at Georgia's. He's able to get back into that form. Then Miami is going to be a very tough matchup for Ohio State. But I think Ohio State's going to be playing with a chip on their shoulder for the remainder of the playoffs like they did last year. And I think this is going to be a little bit of a different case, but you're still coming off of a loss to a big time team in Indiana in that Big Ten championship game. But if you also want to throw it in, Julian saying there was that viral clip of him at the Heisman ceremony with only one person interviewing him while Fernando Mendoza and Diego Pavia got lots of questions, lots of interviews. And then Jeremiah Smith not winning the Blitnikoff despite being the best wide receiver in the country in everyone's minds except the people who voted for the Blitnikoff, but also being the best wide receiver in the Big Ten as they voted on. So they're going to be playing with a chip on their shoulder. I expect an air raid style offense for the majority of this playoffs, and I think Ohio State can easily beat both of these teams if they're able to get back to that high level offense that we expect from them. Now in the semifinals, it's most likely going to be against Georgia. I maybe Ole Miss can learn some things from their earlier loss, but for the most part, we're gonna assume that is going to be against Georgia. And Georgia is looking like the best team in college football right now after a dominant win over Alabama in the SEC championship game, holding their opponents to 10 points or less in their last four matchups, and that includes a very hot Texas team as well. Georgia's defense has been insane, and if they want to beat Ohio State, they're going to need Gunnar Stockton to step it up. Particularly, he's going to need to use his legs a little bit because he has that capability. And they need to shut down this Ohio State offense, put pressure on Julian Sayin. But Ohio State has been able to adjust to that pressure well. And if they're able to lean on their run game, even like they did against Michigan, and were unable to do against Indiana, that's going to take the pressure off of Julian Sane and maybe allow them to get a win against Georgia. And thankfully, this is not a game against Georgia that will be in Atlanta at the Peach Bowl like it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think the main thing for the Buckeyes here is just like Connor said, they don't have to play a road game in a neutral site this time, which has been a very common occurrence actually for Ohio State. It's kind of insane at this point. Now, I think he hit most of the major points. Georgia has a good defense. Ohio State's defense is better. Georgia has a good offense. I think Ohio State's offense is better. I think the Buckeyes would win that game. Now, moving on to the national championship, any one of these six teams could be in it. I think most likely it's going to be Indiana. If not Indiana, I would say Texas Tech. If not Texas Tech, I would say Oregon. Now, mainly going to focus on Indiana because in my bracket, it is the Hoosiers and the Buckeyes facing off in the national championship. What does Ohio State need to do to win this rematch? First of all, you got to limit the turnovers. Julian saying throwing that pick early on, even though it really wasn't his fault, that stuff like that can't happen. Receivers got to hold on to the football. That's step one. Step two, either your starting kicker needs to be able to make a field goal or you need to move on to the backup kicker. It's got to be one of those two things. You're going to need to kick field goals in a tight game like this. And then finally, I think the defense played really well. It's really the line play, both offensive and defensive line. It felt like Indiana was able to push Ohio State around a little bit. They're going to need to fix that up as well. And really, if you're not going to win the trenches, at least have that be an even battle and let your talent on the outside speak for itself. I think Ohio State's secondary can hold down the Indiana receivers in Mendoza. And I think that Ohio State's offense with Julian Sayin and their receivers in Carnell Tate and Jeremy Smith will be able to move the football down the field if the line can hold long enough for Sayin to get the ball out.
Now, if it is a matchup against Texas Tech or Oregon, I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Oregon will be out for revenge from last year, and I think they have a very high-powered offense. Defense is still pretty good, but I don't think it's going to be enough to slow down that high-powered offense that Ohio State has and is very capable of using. It'd be pretty interesting, but I think Ohio State, at least with their front seven, would be able to limit the run game that Oregon kind of needs to give Dante Moore a little bit of a cushion. The Texas Tech matchup would be very interesting, and that's what I have in my bracket. I think the Texas Tech front seven would probably be the toughest matchup Julian Sayin will have in his entire career, quite honestly, because I think they will send as much pressure as they can after him to make him feel uncomfortable. And we have seen Julian Sayin struggle a little bit when he comes under pressure. That's how Indiana was able to keep that game close and ultimately win. Michigan was able to do that earlier on in that game, and even Texas in that first game. If Texas Tech is able to limit the big plays that Ohio State's capable of and still have a consistent offense against a very good Ohio State defense, this game can be close and actually very interesting. And I think it would be a really cinematic national championship. But at the end of the day, there's more firepower on both sides of the ball, more consistent firepower for Ohio State than Texas Tech. We have both said it on several occasions throughout our recording in the last couple videos that we still think Ohio State, despite that loss to Indiana, is probably still the best team in college football. Indiana is right there. Like the margin between those two is very, very close. But I think Ohio State played their worst game against Indiana. When they play even average, I still think they could win that game against Indiana. So we're going to have to see what happens if the Buckeyes can go back to back or if we will be crowning a new national champion this year. So thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more of our content.